Here we
Okay, and then yeah.
go. How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, this is like quite unusual. I don't think I've been in drag and actually had a Zoom conversation, let alone with yourself. So
Okay. This is your first Zoom drag,
first
right?
time, yeah.
Thank you so much for being in drag to do this, because that's that's partly what I want to talk about. But so so you're Fever Dream, right?
Yes, that's right.
Great. So should I call you Fever Dream or Fever?
Oh, either's fine. Yeah, fever dream, fever, either. Yeah.
Perfect.
I
Perfect.
guess fever is my first name, I suppose. Yeah.
I guess, yeah, exactly, exactly. I'm so grateful for you taking the time to do this, because we're this is a bit unusual for a church to host a drag night, but I actually wanted to ask you about your music first of all, if that was that be okay? Because
Yeah, of course.
I've been listening to Mesonoxian, which is the
Ah,
album.
yeah,
Yeah, I
absolutely.
haven't listened to Stet, which I think is that a more recent one?
That's the collaboration with Guy Sigsworth. Yeah, so I
Okay.
feature on, well, I say I, but my alter ego Ilar features on Guy Sigsworth's record Stat. So yeah, I
Okay.
mean it's interesting. My journey into drag has been,
Yeah.
I've been doing it since I was 10 in some form or another. Um, and it kind of is very much bound up with my identity as a trans person.
Yeah.
And at points I stopped doing it because it felt sort of painful in a way, because I felt like I was pretend like a kind of this sort of trans creature inside in a male body pretending to be female. It felt kind of painful or not quite right, and there was a lot of shame as well. I have a kind of lot of religious trauma, I guess maybe you could call it that. Um, and so yeah, my journey into drag has been a strange one. It's been very kind of in and out, but now I am back in. Um, and I think in terms of how it relates to the rest of my identity, I feel like it's like an exaggerated part of myself, I suppose. And Ilar, my regular day-to-day persona, is, I guess, Ilar is quite, you know, less outspoken, perhaps a little bit more on the shy side, a little bit more introverted. And musically as well, there's a real difference between us. I mean, you can probably you probably get some sense of what I might sound like.
I'm
But
looking for you're coming in June. I'm looking forward to that.
yeah, it's my musical side that I don't get to express in the rest of my identity. My solo work as Ilar and the work I do with London Contemporary Voices and Trans Voices, both of which I'm the co-founder, um, tends to be quite serious, I would say, and very precious to me and very important. But it's more on the kind of um, it's a different side to me. It's kind of sadder, softer, quieter, gentler, and I love that. I love slowness and stillness. I don't think we have enough of it in the world. Um, but when I'm like this, it's the other side of me. It's the fire and the kind of the political aspect of my work is very different like this as well. It's much more about um pushing myself into to places that challenge me, and challenge my own views and my own feeling of moving through the world.
So would you say to kind of help so I don't do drag. So how would you help somebody like me to understand what that means for you to be, I mean, you just talked so movingly about it being a way, or perhaps even a pathway, that's my word, not yours, but a way of challenging yourself or moving into spaces that you might not move into otherwise. Is that part of what it is, what it's like? Tell me what it's like.
What's it like? I guess drag is sort of like I guess it's the performance of exaggerated gender, masculinity, femininity, and other forms of gender expression. So it's actually much more expansive, especially now. I mean, you could even sort of get into, is this female impersonation? What does that mean? And why is long hair and lipstick female rather than feminine rather than masculine?
What would you say? What would you say to that question? Actually, that's really interesting. What would you say to that question about whether it's female impersonation or what's feminine about Fever Dream as the way that you perform?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot, especially as a trans person, and I certainly have thought about it a lot, because sometimes, you know, having the experience of moving through the world and people reading you a certain way, I guess gender is learned, and I guess it's something that is very much a societal construct, I guess, and something that we create as people. And gender expression, I guess, is part of that. And I think really when you deconstruct it, you think, well, yeah, what is that? And why is this eye shape considered feminine, for example? Why would that be? I mean, it's, you know, it's not like there's a particular reason for that. And I think it's more, I think sometimes there's a fear that drag is mocking a particular gender.
Right.
But actually,
Okay. Right.
you
And
know,
what would you say? What would you say about that?
I think that's interesting, because I think it's almost like saying classical music is misogynistic or mocking a particular gender, or Renaissance paintings are doing that, or I don't know, electronic music or any art form. I mean, it's an art form. So I think the thing to say about that is it can be, just in the way that any art form can be. But really and truly, I think, especially these days, nearly all drag I've ever seen in my life certainly subverts gender norms, and it really sort of tries to get underneath and upheave those differences between us and what they really are, and how much of it's appearance and how much of it's reality, and what sort of really sits behind a person. And I guess in that sense, I'm exaggerating parts of myself rather than mocking something outside of myself. If that makes sense. I mean, I don't think I'm not trying to look like anyone in particular. This is very much me, a very exaggerated part of me. And you know, you could pick that into so many different ways. The fact that I'm a brown person with blonde hair and I've made my eyes pink. I mean, you know, who am I trying to look like? I don't know.
That's really helpful, actually. So what you would say is that you're expressing, you're expressing a part of yourself rather than making a comment on the way that other people might perceive femininity, for example.
Yeah, I would say so. That's the core of it. But then, of course, by virtue of doing it, you then also have this effect of challenging those gender norms. And I think even, you know, if I compare it to being trans, which is definitely not the same thing, so that's another thing that people often conflate the two.
Could you help us again? Could you say something about that different, because those two things are completely different, or they're separate? Can you say a bit about that?
Yes. So I guess what it comes down to is the difference between okay, let's say there's a difference between sex, gender, and gender expression, and sexuality. These are all different things, but they're often sort of confused or put together in the same thing. So I guess slightly dangerous water, but sex, I guess, is perhaps what people might consider biological. You know, what you're assigned at birth, what's kind of your body is physically doing in terms of gender, I suppose, in terms of sex, in terms of what sex organs you have, I guess.
Yeah.
But then gender is much more about how you feel inside. So who you feel you are in terms of your gender, that's a very different thing. And then sexuality is who you're attracted to. And then gender expression is how you present yourself to the world. So there would be nothing to say that a non-trans heterosexual person couldn't dress like this and still be themselves. That might just be how they want to express their gender on the outside with the clothes they wear. And of course, you see, my view on it is that clothes themselves don't have a gender. You know, this hair doesn't have a gender. It's made of plastic. It doesn't make any sense to think of it as having a gender. So I suppose there are many layers to these things, and it's easy to get muddled, especially in the way that we learn and navigate the world growing up.
And what are the consequences of muddling that up, do you think? I mean, they're quite, they're difficult, aren't they? They're negative.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of consequences, and most of them, the worst ones, I think, fall on the marginalized people that they affect. So transgender people being confused with drag, for example, kind of gives people the impression that transgender people, it's kind of dress up and play and a costume or a wolf in sheep's clothing, all of these sorts of kind of things that come up for people. And then therefore also, if you're wearing a costume, then who's the real you underneath it? And are you dangerous to me? Those are the sorts of ideas that go on. But of course, for trans people, that is who they are. You know, it's not dressing up. It's not pretending to be someone that you're not, who you really are. Drag, I guess, is I wouldn't even describe it as necessarily dressing up to be someone else. I think it's actually, especially because most drag artists have a persona, and you know, this is mine. I think it's another part of you, and I think it's almost like an exaggerated part of you. And it can reveal a lot to you. It can teach you a lot about yourself, and it can also teach you a lot about the world. So, I mean, I would say walking down the street dressed like this and how people perceive you, the things that people say, the things that people do, the things that people feel it gives them permission to do or say, is interesting in itself, and helpful, I think, in how we understand ourselves as human and as people, and how we perceive each other, how we respond to each other, the space we create for each other.
And what would you, I mean, that's absolutely fascinating that you feel that this art form, especially when you're with other people in public, I guess you're talking about not just on a stage where people will have chosen to come and see and hear and engage, but walking down a street where that's much more kind of anarchic environment, isn't it? What do you learn about people then, or what is revealed to you about people and the way that we might stereotype each other, or the way that we behave each other, by the way that people treat you or speak to you, or as you just said, what they feel allowed to do or allowed to say? What do you learn?
I think you learn where misogyny really is. I think that's one thing, because I think when you dress like this, it kind of almost, people perceive it as a permission of, you're asking for it, or you're asking for attention, or you're asking, it gives them permission to say whatever they might like to say in their head. I think what's also really fascinating, so I mean, we could talk about what's going on in America in terms of drag shows being banned and being classified as almost adult entertainment. And what I find fascinating about that is, looking at me right now, I'm very clothed. And to sort of like, you think, well, who is doing the sexualizing in this situation? If someone looks at this and says, oh, that's very sexualized, in what way? What am I saying or doing that's sexual? I'm wearing clothes. And even if I wasn't, I mean, why would that be automatically sexual? And you realize that actually the misogyny and the sexualization is coming the other direction. It's those people kind of perhaps with unaddressed kind of misogyny, I think, is probably what's going on. It reminds me a little bit. There is a Marina Abramovich piece, I think it's called Rhythm Zero, where it's like, I think in the late 70s, she did a performance in a museum, I think it was, or an art gallery, probably an art gallery. She was an artist after all. And there was I think some kind of tray or table with objects on them, and she stood there naked, and it was basically, you can do whatever to my body. There are some objects here that you can use for that. And what is fascinating about that and frightening is, in that situation where people are given permission to do whatever they like, you had all sorts of reactions. Some people wanted to put a blanket around her and cover her up. Some people wanted to stop her from doing it, or censor parts of her body. Other people wrote things on her body with pens. Some people cut her. There was a loaded gun on the table as well. And when you think about that, you think, my God, like when you take away the rules, it's frightening how quickly people can get to a point of wanting to harm another person, or go to that place with it. And I think that's very revealing. And I think in a way that's kind of almost like sometimes what the experience of drag can be like. I imagine we also have something in common, Lucy, in that, because of how we dress.
I was just about to say that it's so great to talk to you. You're making me feel very conscious about what I'm wearing in a way that I'm just trying to compute as we go along. But I mean, in a sense, because this is a stereotypically male shirt, and when women were first priests, there was a lot of discussion about, because it's very recent, it's only 25 years ago, right? So there was lots of discussion amongst us. What was going to be, what should we wear, I suppose, to be taken seriously as priests, which is kind of this, or do you make it something new and something different? And then there was a little bit of a kind of, I responding to what you were talking about, exaggeration, because there was a little bit of an argument to say that some of the women wanted to wear very stereotypically feminine kind of shirts, and at the time there were these they were called lady di collars. They were quite high and they were frilly, and they had lots of flowers, and then you would have this little dog collar in the middle. And right at the beginning there was it was quite sharp discussion actually about how to dress so that you weren't just cross-dressing, if you can even use that phrase, dressing up in men's clothes. Were you a real priest, right? There was always that question. And I've actually responded very strongly to what you said about when you put on a costume or a uniform of any kind, you immediately somehow invite the question, who are you really?
Yes. Yeah. Who's underneath? And also I think the assumption that you are pretending to be someone else, and therefore how that relates to trust. And there was an article recently, and I can't remember where it is, so this is very like I cannot give you my sources. Not very scientific over here. But there was an article that it was about, it was in Australia, I remember this much, and it was looking at when people wear lots of makeup, kind of, I guess, like how I am, they are taken less seriously and they are not trusted as much. And it was almost even like in terms of beauty standards that cisgender straight men found women who wore a lot of makeup that they couldn't quite trust them, or that they didn't quite know who they really were. That kind of idea, I guess. And so I think it's sort of, there's a way that it kind of permeates everything, I think. And actually, like, one thing I was going to say was one thing we both have in common in terms of how we dress as well is that people tend to either be slightly, perhaps slightly, can be a little intimidated or avoidant of you, but they can also sort of feel the need to confess things. So I've had this experience so many times with other people I know that do drag. People kind of come and find you and they start confiding in you and they start telling you things. And I think in a way, maybe partly what's going on is they look at you and think, well, you are obviously you know, really quite at the lowest of the low. So I can tell you anything and you're not going to be shocked. It's interesting. There's a real very strange the way that people respond to you. And it can also be wonderful. It can also be really transformative, and you can see almost that people see themselves in you, and they see a possibility for themselves sometimes as well.
What kind of exchange would you say, just to, again, when you say it can be wonderful and transformative, have you got a kind of exchange that you could say, or anonymize it if you need to, just to help understand what that might look like?
Of course. I mean, okay, so okay, let me think about this. So RuPaul famously said that, controversially actually, gay men don't do drag to mock women. They do drag to mock the cultural concept of identity. And this idea that drag needs to be done by men because it's sort of a big FU to male dominated culture. So for men to do it is really kind of, punk rock and a rejection of masculinity. Right. And I think RuPaul's wrong about that. And I think RuPaul now knows that, hence the inclusion of cisgender women in drag now. But we still don't have drag kings on Drag Race, as the main sort of platform for it. And where I'm going with all of this, I think, is that there's something about drag that, because it's so extreme, it can be very inspiring. Because, I mean, if I think about myself as a teenager secretly exploring my gender in the privacy of my bedroom and, dressing up in women's clothing or adapting my clothing to be women's clothing and presenting that way in the privacy of my own space, and sometimes boldly going out, seeing something like this, it's such an extreme version of it that there is no hiding. And I think, in a way, if I leave the house like this, there's no possibility for me to hide in the shadows in any way, shape, or form. I'm extremely visible, and there's something about that can break you out of that fear of how you're going to be perceived, and it can kind of make you carry yourself in a different way. And I think when people see that, it can be inspiring, because if you yourself, for example, I mean, in whatever direction, if you are, say, perhaps assigned male at birth, but want to express your femininity and are absolutely terrified, and like the idea of walking down the street wearing high heel shoes, or I don't know, wearing your hair long, or whatever it might be, and what are people going to say if I paint my nails? All these sorts of things. Seeing somebody do it in a much more extreme way can kind of create space for you. In a way, I guess, in that sense, it expands the space in which we can all exist in, because there is somebody kind of pushing that boundary further, so that there is more room for everyone nearer to that space. And I think drag kings do exactly that as well in the other direction. And, drag kings are, I mean, just like, this is another form of misogyny, really, in the way that no one ever talks about drag kings, in the way that no one ever talks about trans men. Whenever we have those conversations, it's kind of no one really quite knows what to say. But there's this really amazing culture in the UK of drag kings. Lads, which is an amazing drag king night, sells out every time. And there's a reason for that, because it's absolutely fantastic, and it's just as much of a art form as being a drag queen or a drag in between, as I suppose I am. Yeah, sorry, I think I don't even know if I answered your question. I think
Yeah,
I
no,
went
that's
so
really
far
interesting.
around the place.
So I may not have heard this properly, but tell me. So that controversial quote that you quoted from RuPaul, where it was essentially a critique of a male-dominated society and therefore was in one direction, if I can put it that way. But actually, what drag really is, or is at its core, is a, and again, this is my word, you haven't used this, but maybe you might agree with this. Is it a kind of a queering of the categories in any direction, and in a kind of an expansion, as you said, to make more room for all of us to be in? So it's more fundamentally expansive than it is a critique of one gender or one expression of gender.
Yes, and I think that is how it began. That's kind of what it is at its core. But of course, like everything, and like I said right at the start, everything sort of misogyny permeates absolutely everything, whether it's drag, whether it's music, whether it's the church, whether it's anything, absolutely anything. And that's the thing we all need to kind of address. And so yes, I think drag in the UK does have that element of prioritizing people who are assigned male at birth, but in the same way that absolutely everything in the entertainment industry does. Though that's not to say that is what drag is, and that's not to say that that's what drag artists want. I think if you ask most drag performers, they are very much pushing for as much of an inclusive space as possible. And you know, the drag shows certainly that I perform at are absolutely incredibly diverse and very loving spaces, and very welcoming of all identities.
Would it be true to say, as far as the trajectory goes, I mean, right now drag is much more mainstream than it has been, and we might get onto that in a moment, but the kind of from you know, I mean, from me, you know, I grew up with television, Danny LaRue on television and Edna Everage, and that was kind of mainstream Saturday night telly as well, but wasn't kind of named as a drag act or as a kind of whole genre like RuPaul's Drag Race. But is it true to say that it's been mostly men driving the drag culture, as it were, until relatively recently, or am I mistaken about that?
No, I would say that if you look at the kind of where drag really happens, and happened before it went mainstream, that was always going to be in queer spaces and in underground queer spaces, and in those spaces drag kings and drag queens have coexisted, especially in the UK. In terms of the history, that's very much the case. But then when you look at anything in the mainstream, if you look at who's making the decisions as to what goes on TV sets, it's mostly men. So you know, if you look at it from that perspective, whenever anything goes mainstream at all, it usually, the decision making is usually very male dominated. But that's not to say that that at its origins, where it happens in the grassroots of things, it's like that. And there are lots of artists now, especially, who, I mean, I actually I have it in mind to start a drag king act myself. There are lots of artists that do both. There are lots of artists that would classify themselves as a drag thing, a kind of like, their goal is to subvert gender to the extent that you can't really place them. They're a kind of like a creature, like, you know, I've seen drag performances of people coming out as, you know, octopuses or clowns or all sorts of things, and I think the more expansive it can be, the better. Yeah.
I mean, can I ask you about the kind of religious part of it? I mean, you know, we feel really excited about this as a kind of experimental space for us to invite into a space that is a church space, drag artists to simply do what you do and be who you are. That's an exciting thing for us to do. I can't pretend that it's not controversial though, and for all different reasons. But do you, I mean, say as much as you want to say, and don't say any more than you want to say, but how do you what has religion meant in this space, in the kind of drag space, and what could it mean, I suppose? Because I can see lots of possibility for it, but I also don't want to just gloss over that, you know, as you called it, religious trauma at the beginning, and that's why I want to be careful about this. So please just say what you want to say, but can you just say a little bit about how you feel about all of that?
I think there is no one way that I feel about it. I think it's immensely complex for me, and I think for a lot of people it is. I would say that many people, okay, I mean, there are some things I can say that are kind of, oh, where to begin? I would say, what I would say is that there is a sort of tradition and a culture in both in drag and also in the trans community and in the LGBT community rather more widely, of chosen family. And I think connected with religious trauma, many LGBT children still to this day find themselves homeless because of parental rejection, or because of usually often connected with something connected with religion often. And I guess I was in that situation in some sense. I was raised Catholic, and although my mum is extremely loving and very, she loves me in drag, we went on a journey to get here, I would say. And of course, this is in the 90s when the AIDS epidemic was in full force, and I think there is a lot of trauma within the community at many levels. Sometimes but mostly when I think of it, it is the political elements of religion, rather than the sort of faith and spiritual beliefs that underlie, or should underlie, those things. And when I think about that, I always return to the thoughts I had when I was a teenager, grappling with my own sexuality, particularly, which I always got to the place of, well, how can it be? It seemed like it didn't add up in my mind that that a God wouldn't be able to get their head round me and my identity, and not see that there is at my core just love, you know. And I just had that strong feeling of like, surely that just doesn't make sense. It doesn't sort of compute. And that's where I return to, and so I know people who are people of faith, people who aren't, who do drag, who don't. But I also know a lot of people who carry an incredible amount of religious trauma and have suffered parental rejection, or difficulty in coming out, at various points. And I think also the other element I would say is that's kind of in terms of, like, I guess how drag intersects with sexuality, I think,
right.
And maybe also gender identity. But there is also, in terms of gender identity, and I guess there is this long legacy of this argument that it's unnatural, you know, that kind of idea, that homosexuality, queerness, transness are not natural, and that's the issue. And that and I've looked into that quite a lot and done a lot of research into what's going on in nature, really, and what we know, and how phenomenally diverse nature is in terms of sexuality, gender, yeah, sex even is not really dimorphic in a lot of species, and yeah, it's just fascinating. And you know, you kind of find out about sequential hermaphrodites, like not banana slugs, they're just straight up hermaphrodites, but like slipper limpets that can change gender, or like even chickens can be literally half male and half female in the same form, and just how incredibly diverse and expansive nature is. And that's actually nature's strength. That's actually our strength as a community and as a species, to have that diversity there is the key to our survival. It's how we got this far. That's certainly how I feel about it.
I mean, it just, even in theological terms, if I can say, you know, there's the doctrine of creation, that God created and creates, you know, it's in the nature of God to create. And this simply goes on and on all the time. If you're thinking about what God does all day, God simply creates and creates and creates. Actually, what you're saying is that whole essence of who God is can be expressed in every form of human creativity, but also the whole of the created order, which is much more non-binary than you know, a traditional church doctrine might have assumed.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I've been absolutely fascinated. I was sort of looking at the conversation going on at the moment about God's pronouns.
Yeah.
I found that absolutely fascinating, because of course, I mean, you know, when I talked to my mum about my mum's Catholic, as I mentioned, and I talked to her about it, you know, she's very sure that God is neither male or female, and that angels and when you go to heaven, you don't really have a gender anymore, and just sort of, you know, whatever, a soul. Not that I personally don't believe that, but I think that it's so interesting because it's kind of, because that's going on at the same time as this, you know, yeah, I don't even know what word to use, this situation we have, the way that trans lives are being sort of debated and centered in debate in the UK, and now also other forms of queerness, I suppose, other forms of otherness, you know, like
Yeah,
drag.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating, because actually when you look at nature, it's so incredibly abundant, I would say, phenomenally abundant. You know, there are literally, I think I read recently that they reckon around 95% of species exhibit some form of what we would call homosexuality, gender expansiveness, hermaphroditism, or yeah, transness, queerness, otherness, polyamory, whatever it might be. It's all going on.
Yeah.
And I think it's also interesting, even when you look at what people like to say about that, they tend to try and find a way to look at it from a very male lens, actually, looking at it as there must be a reason for it, and maybe it's to do with power dynamics. I even read something that they were trying to figure out. I think it was now was it the it was I think it's a type of lizard that there are lots of these lizards that have single sex relationships between females, and someone had this theory that the reason that they were in single sex relationships was to kind of give the male lizard some kind of show, to be like, to sort of arouse the male.
Oh, I see. Right.
And you kind of just think, well, that's I've definitely heard a lot of men say similar things.
Right.
Like,
right.
well,
Right.
what's that founded on? Absolutely nothing. There's no, that's just like such a hypothesis that's just completely out of nowhere.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
so I think the way that we look at nature, the way that we look at morality, the way that we look at faith, religion, all of these things, it would be, I think the goal for me is to try and look at them through a wider lens.
And do you think, I mean, I suppose there's one of the things that I'm learning from this conversation is that the way that you have explained what it's like to express yourself this way is both a challenge and also an invitation, as you said, to confession for some people, or it opens and expands rather than shuts down. And it also it connects in a surprising way, perhaps, with parts of other people that they don't know themselves are there until they connect with you, for example. So, I mean, all of that sounds thoroughly like, I don't want to take over it, but it just sounds like church to me. I mean, that's kind of, it may sound a bit crazy to you to say that, but if I had to sum up what I thought we were trying to do in church, it's stuff like that. It's helping people be more themselves and discover new parts of themselves and open and become vulnerable and connect and simply be the person that God has made them to be, which is much more mysterious, precious, and beautiful than anyone can imagine. So that's been a really amazing thing to hear you talking about in that way, because it makes me more maybe determined. I don't know. It makes me more glad that we're having a go at this, because I think that the drag culture, if that's what happens in drag culture, and that's what the church is trying to do some of, then these are meeting points. They're not oppositions, and
Absolutely.
And it shouldn't be controversial at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think people often resist or fear things that are challenging, and that I could see why someone would be a little bit intimidated by someone dressed like this. But there's so much to be gained from it. And I think as well, just from a very practical point of view, I think for young LGBT people, given the mental health epidemic we're in, for want of a better word, when I think of the community here where I live, and what we're trying to do for the young people that I know, I know how many of them are struggling, how many of them self-harm, are suicidal, and just simply because of how who they are is perceived in society, and the bullying and othering that they're subjected to. And if we can hold space as a community, and if we can expand the space that we can think in and feel in and be in, then we can deepen empathy and human connection. And that, I think, is the only way forward for humanity. I mean, we're not gonna get anywhere without that kind of deepening of empathy and love. And although it may seem like a strange way to do it, there is something about, I think a lot of drag queens are at least 50% clown, and I think there is something about clowning and being playful and allows you to explore ideas, and it allows you to, there's a whole degree of storytelling and possibility and expanding the space in which we think through performance and through arts and through conversation, more than anything. I mean, conversations like this. And that's the other thing I wanted to say, is that one of the things I think that is so wonderful about this is often we don't actually, because of the way that the medium has shifted, drag queens often spoke But these days often it's very much dance based or singing based, which is obviously great. But I think the possibility of conversation is so incredibly powerful.
Right,
Um,
right.
and
I believe that conversations can be revolutionary if
absolutely.
you're really listening, if you're really in groups. Say, do you, would you talked about deepening empathy just now. Do you give drag that purpose? I mean, obviously there's huge fun in it, and there's huge joy in it, and there's a kind of what do I mean? Well, actually, no, joy is the word. Whenever I've experienced drag, there's a joy in it. But would you give it that kind of moral purpose that you've just said about deepening empathy and helping to transform society and giving us a greater sense of compassion for each other? Would you give it that high moral purpose as well as the kind of fun, or not?
I would say that, as I said about drag being an art form, you can give it that purpose, and many do. And if you drill down to why people do it, the ones that there are, I would say most drag queens are very beautiful, empathetic people with a story to tell. Something pushed them to do that, and often it has a root in wanting to make the world a better place. A lot of drag is very political as well. My drag personally is a lot of what I talk about. The reason I've been talking about nature a lot is because I have one show that I do about nature, about queerness in nature, based on an essay by Elliot Schaefer, which I really love, to kind of challenge that notion. But I also talk a lot about racism, particularly racism, but racism within the queer community, racism as a whole. But there's also something else that comes up in drag, which is gallows humor.
Yeah.
And I think humor is one of the ways that humor and storytelling, again, I mean, that's very much, I mean, maybe not so much the humor, but the storytelling of the Bible, for example. We learn through story, we learn through sharing story and passing down stories. And that's also true in the queer community. And that's also true in how we once had to code things in language to remain safe and to communicate various ideas. But I think the gallows humor within drag is also a way of exploring things, because you've got someone, perhaps sometimes if you walked into one of my performances, you might think it was a bit vulgar or a bit kind of like, oh my goodness, that's like the humor is very dark sometimes. But the purpose of that is to challenge stereotypes and to challenge perception. And with that, I think sometimes it can go, just like with any art form, sometimes those things can go in perhaps the wrong direction. And I have a rule for myself, which is never punch down on anybody. Basically, I'm punching myself.
or punch up,
or punch up. Yeah, exactly. And that's
I've realized as we're talking, I've descended into some sepulchral gloom, and yes. I'm thinking this is a really good metaphor for the kind of amazing, light of drag, and for the church just fading into oblivion. So I'm going to just put a light on. Just hold on a second.
Oh, that's
very warm. I realized, my goodness. I wanted to ask you just a little bit about humor, actually, because again, one of the aspects. So we've in part of the blurb we've been writing about what we are doing by inviting drag artists to perform in the church, is that it's an evening of, I think one of the words we've used is kindness. So one of the values that we want as a church to promote is kindness. And I suppose there's a question about that sometimes, isn't there? Because some of the humor in drag, I mean, it's any humor, but some of the humor can be quite cruel. But what you're saying is that you try not to for that humor to become a kind of bullying humor for somebody for somebody else, that you're trying to, for it to be self-deprecating. But could you say a little bit about that? Because we want it to be, without it being too worthy, you know, we do want it to have a kindness about it. Do you think that's possible with drag?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, what really springs to mind is drag houses immediately. I did speak about chosen family earlier. I have some drag children. My partner has drag children. Also, as a trans person, I have children who are people who, for whatever reason, can't have difficult relationships with their family and their family of birth family, I suppose. And so there are these families that, and I don't think I've ever known a kinder place, because what binds those people is only that. It's only love and kindness. There isn't that sort of it's not kind of just learnt behavior or kind of playing out a conditioned idea of family. It's really going out of your way to create space for somebody else and lift somebody else up. And what I see in my community of the way people take care of each other is really beautiful. It's really genuinely beautiful. And that's not to say there isn't trauma. That's not to say that there aren't sometimes challenges with how people interact with each other. That's not to say that there aren't sometimes problems with things like misogyny or sexism or racism within drag communities. All of those things are possible, just like they are in the church or in schools or in anywhere, hospitals, wherever. And so we all have to take responsibility, and that's why also it's so important to have elders in the community and intergenerational things. And that's why, you know, drag story times are so important, and ways to connect different generations of the art form, so that we all learn and we all pass on that same sort of kindness and love and respect, but also learn the other direction as well. Because, you know, like I mentioned earlier, RuPaul at one point had a very narrow idea, I would say, of who should be allowed to be doing drag, and there is still some way to go with that, I feel. But I feel like there is a learning there that's happened from an elder, a celebrated elder, learning from the children, learning from, actually, do you know what, we want to do it differently. We want to expand the way that we do this. But absolutely, I think there can be an incredible warmth and kindness. And I'd also say that even there's a tradition in drag of reading. And I would say with my daughter, my chosen daughter, that we have a sense of humor that is very much a gallows humor. And at one of my shows recently, I called out, because I knew she was in the audience, and I said something like, I was talking about racism, and in the story, I have this relationship with someone who's racist towards me, and I'm pondering, actually, maybe I want that. Maybe part of me wants that. And I said, don't I deserve that? And I said, don't I deserve that? Asking her. And she said, Mother, you deserve absolutely nothing in this world. But of course, like the humor of it is kind of like, of course she doesn't mean that, but it's the way that we bounce off each other, and the way that we kind of play with those ideas of like, almost like parodying a toxic mother and daughter relationship, can reveal a lot about our real relationships. And it usually comes from a very real place, you know.
So that exchange, you know, I can see, and that was held in public, that exchange with an audience. You know, you'd have to trust one another a lot to have that exchange, and for that not to have been hurtful, I suppose, in a way. But you're talking about the use, I guess, you're talking about the use of parody to reveal something true, or something, and something difficult. Absolutely.
And I think also using humor to look back through, like I can give you an example actually that relates to my religious upbringing. One of the things I realized recently, was that the priest, one of the priests in my growing up, who's no longer with us, was called Father Sheehy. And I remember
I see,
thinking, like,
right.
how funny is that? How absolutely like brilliant. And often what he was saying could be quite you know, I don't know, perhaps not as progressive when it came to gender and sexuality.
You're choosing your words carefully, I can tell.
But the fact that his name was she, I just thought that's almost like a drag name.
Right, right.
You know, and I think some of those things, some of the places where I found compassion and love really surprised me in that growing up. There was a convent where there was a youth club, and I used to go to the youth club, and I remember very much when I came out to my mum, I get choked up when I think about it. One of the sisters there said to her, "Don't worry about it. Don't all your job. Just love them. Just love them. That's just focus on that." And you know, to return it always back to that. And that's the difference, I think, between spirituality and the kind of organized structure of religion, which is prone to the same things that any structure is, any school, any drag community. We're all prone to those very human pitfalls of you know, yeah.
I don't want to take too much of your time, but we've had about an hour, so I was going to kind of bring it to a conclusion, but I really wanted to ask you if you could dream of, and you know, if you could dream of a society that as it should be, with a church as it could be, as part of that society, what advice would you give me as a priest?
I mean, my goodness, I think I would say let us live is something that I've thought up of so much when I was thinking of dear young Brianna Jai, and we had a vigil here for her, and the thing that just comes up for me is let us live and let us in. And I think the idea of I think collective responsibility for all of our children, for all of our vulnerable people, for all of us and for each other. And I feel like conversation, to hold space for each other and to really listen and listen deeply, and to take time, I think, to do that, to slow down, to really slow down. I think half the problems we get into as humans is through approaching everything with such great speed. I feel like if we could slow down and just take that time to have a conversation, I think many people would probably look at me, how I'm presenting right now, and have all sorts of assumptions as to what might be in my heart or in my head, and perhaps hopefully be quite surprised by a conversation they might have with me. And what we can learn from each other, but also that runs in all directions, that also applies to me, you know, that I'm as open to this conversation, I'm as open to coming to St. James like this, because I am equally open to that. I mean, I don't know, do you think I'll burst into flames? Is there a possibility?
We could arrange that if that would help your act.
It might be quite fun. It might be quite fun.
I'm sure we can make it happen.
I always wanted to try pirate.
No, not at all. Not at all. I really want to thank you. This has been an amazing experience. Really, thank you so much. And we had a night recently where Barbara, who's our resident drag artist, did a great evening where anybody could come and ask any question they liked. And one of the things I learned from that evening was the hours that it takes to prepare to be able to do the act. So thank you not only for having the conversation but for preparing for it. I'm really looking forward to it. You're going to come at the beginning of Pride Month, so we're going to kick off Pride with that evening preach. I'm hugely grateful to you. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you for holding this space for this conversation.
I hope we can speak again. I'd love
Yeah,
that.
me too. I would love that. I would love that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
And one note I will leave on is that although it did take me a really long time to get ready, I am wearing my slippers. So
I didn't want to ask.
for the first time in drag, I'm just cozy in my slippers, and it's nice to not wear high shoes.
Dragon slippers, that's a whole new thing, right? Thank you.
Well,
thank you so much.
Yeah, take care.
Okay, I'll see you soon. Thank you.
Soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.